Greetings, diners, and welcome to another edition of the Collapse Cafe here on the Doomstead Diner. Today, we are having our special Brexit edition. As I think everybody in the Collapse community knows, Brits voted themselves in a referendum to leave the EU. They haven't left it yet, but that's what they voted to do, and now there's all the fallout from that. So I'm with a couple of my Brit friends, Jason Heppenstall, who runs the blog 22 Billion Energy Slaves, is here with me, and also my regular co-host Monsta, who is another Brit living in London. I think Jason is in Cornwall. Is that right, Jason?
Yeah, right.
So we're going to get the Brit perspective on what's going on there, and we'll be talking about that in a couple of minutes. Before we do that, though, I want to do a plug for the Sun Foundation, which is our 501c3 foundation concerned with the energy problems that we have with developing renewable energy solutions and with food and bringing better and more sustainable food production techniques to people, and with providing good, affordable shelters for people. So you will see up in the corner over here, or it might be over in this corner, I'm not sure, a little card that will pop up and allow you to make a donation to the Sun Project. It is tax deductible if you choose to help us out and make a better tomorrow. Besides that, I also like to do a little promotion preview for another Collapse Cafe I'll be doing in a couple of days on Tuesday at I think it's 4 p.m. Eastern Time with the Billionaire Buddha, a fellow who was once a member of the 0.01%, who gave away his money and changed his life. And we're going to find out a little bit more about him and about the reasons for his decision. Okay, with all that said, let's get to the topic at hand, which is Brexit and the fallout that we've seen so far. Monsto, how are you seeing the political fallout there with, Cameron saying he's going to resign and Jeremy Corbyn sacking half of his cabinet or them quitting on him? What's going on with all that?
Well, to be honest, it's kind of in the political front. It's a pandemonium. There's, like you mentioned, Cameron has given in his resignation. He's not quitting just yet. He's gonna step down by October, but his main intention is, as quote unquote, is just to steady the ship. So he's just hanging around so that the Conservative Party has enough time to elect a new leader for the party. But I think at the moment he's just like a lame duck, as it were. Nobody's gonna take him so seriously because he's going to go in the next few months, and that's the situation there. I think the other problem is that with the Labour Party as well, because I think Corbyn faces a crisis of confidence. He's got an open rebellion going on. A big chunk of his his shadow cabinet is resigning, tends to resign just today, and he sacked another person yesterday. So again, the Labour Party is in disarray. And the other thing that I see that compounds the Labour problem is they only had Corbyn for just over a year. So to have another one is to mean they have had 3 leaders in the space of like 15 months or something. So they're in a real crisis, and I think there's a disconnect between them and the Labour and the voters. So that's a problem there. And then after beyond that, you've got the situation in Scotland with the Scottish vying for a referendum, which has a realistic chance of going through, and on top of that, you've got the Irish election, I should say referendum, but I think that one is a bit of a long shot. I don't think that will happen, but it just underlines the fact that everything is just in a state of chaos, and nobody really knows what's going to happen. And the Brexit campaigners like Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, it doesn't seem clear at this moment of time there's much of a game plan what they're going to do about the upcoming negotiations. That is just a big blank spot. So that's the situation politically.
Jason, talking about the fact that you've got, Cameron as a lame duck leader, and Corbyn has basically a mutiny on his hands. What other political figures are there to step up to the plate and to try to, bring each of these parties to some type of a steady state, so that they actually can do some negotiation? Who's gonna go in there and negotiate the Brexit with the clowns from Brussels?
Well, that's a good point, because I mean, both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, they've kind of dug their own graves by being, they're both neoliberal parties. Let's face it, and that's what's got Labour into this big problem at the moment. They didn't connect with their own, kind of core voters in this referendum. And you kind of got to feel sorry, in a way, for Jeremy Corbyn, because he's a fundamentally decent human being, but he's just been crushed by the nasty political system that we've got, because he was himself a Eurosceptic. He didn't believe in the European Union being able to kind of dictate to the UK. But he had to sacrifice his principles and pretend that he was in favour of them. So then we had this referendum when we had him stood next to David Cameron, if you like, which completely isolated his own core voters, in all the industrial areas of the north, or de-industrial, I should say, and all over the country, really. So because of that, he's also a lame duck now. He's being stabbed in the back as we speak. David Cameron is a lame duck. There's no way back for him. So yeah, I mean, who is standing in the shadows? We've got Boris Johnson, who wants to be leader, I think, and he, of course, used to be the mayor of London. He's quite a colourful, flamboyant character. He loves to play the fool in front of cameras. He's a very intelligent person. He's a historian. He's written books. He's he can hold himself in any debate. But people hate him generally. I mean, the thing that I hear over and over again is that he's a fascist, and I was like, really? So I thought, well, is he really a fascist? So I looked into it. I tried to find out what his politics were, and I couldn't really find an awful lot. I mean, when he was London mayor, he was fairly popular. He introduced bicycles, like they're called Boris bikes, to the capital, and he introduced a number of other measures that were reasonably popular. But then I kind of found out that he's labelled as being very right wing because he's very politically incorrect, like Donald Trump. He calls people names and sort of thing. And so
Yeah.
whether he gets to the league or not, I don't know. Sorry.
Well, then there's that other one who was very much on the side of the Brexit, which is Nigel Farage.
Oh yeah.
Let me go to Monster on this. Nobody's talking about Nigel as a possibility. Is he hated that much, or what?
Yeah, he is. He's pretty much. A lot of people hate him. He's a divisive character. and he's not a member of the Conservative Party. So don't forget, when we have an election over here, we vote for a party, not a person. So at the moment, the Conservative Party are in power. They have to pick someone from within their own ranks, and he's not. You know, he's got his own party, United Kingdom Independence Party, and the whole raison d'etre of his party was to get this referendum, which we've now had. So he's kind of, you know, eliminated his own need for existing in a way. But at the same time, he is an MEP, like a member of the European Parliament, and he tends to go there and he just turns his back on things. He's well known for that, because he doesn't believe in the validity of it. So I don't think there's any chance of him, you know, being a leader. I think he might be involved in negotiations, but he's definitely being sidelined.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Monster? How do you think Farage is going to play? What kind of role is he going to play in this? I mean, I've heard that that argument that now that the UK has voted for independence, that the rationale behind the UK Independence Party is gone. But I don't know that that's really true. I mean, if they're the ones that led for, you know, the drive for independence, one would think that that they've won. So now that they should be, you know, the ones in charge negotiating with Brussels. That's the way I would look at it. Monster, what do you think about the future of the UKIP and Nigel Farage?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Jason that if he was to be involved, he'd be an advisor of some sort. And it has already been said that that if they want to bring in a new government, the Tory government specifically, that the leader would have to be a pro-Leave person. So that would rule out people like Osborne, who was a person who sided with Cameron and was advocate of the Remain campaign. So I think there is the logic of what you're saying, that they need to have people who pushed for independence striking a deal out. And I think that's going to be the real test, because, you know, they talk about freedom and independence, but you know, you need to define what those things mean exactly, because, you know, in this sort of climate, one of the reasons for the EU is to make the European countries relevant in this new world where you have a multipolar world. You know, you have China, you have America, and you know, you have I could say India maybe in the future. You have all these big states. They're going to have a massive say, and what is England going to do on their own in this kind of environment? And that is the logic behind the EU. So, you know, this is just like, you know, about independence and freedom. You know, it's all well good being free, but what does that mean? You know, that's like kind of saying, are you free if you're unemployed and you're on the streets and you can't get any food? You know, you can say what you want, but you won't have food on the tables. So it's kind of meaningless. So I think they need to really figure out what they want, and I think this is a challenge. I think that this Farage has. I would definitely say his job is not over. In fact, it's just the end of the beginning. Just to steal a quote there. That's what I feel.
Winston Churchill.
Yeah. So I just think, you know, if Farage wants to follow through with his dream, he needs to be involved on some level. I don't know if he will be sidelined, especially if things start going badly. He might be used as a scapegoat, and it remains to be seen what he wants exactly. Because does he want to be part of the market?
Looks like we lost Monster here for a little.
Immigration. He's already been seen to be lying about the NHS claim. If you're not familiar, he made the claim that it costs £350 million a week for England to be in the EU, and that can go to the NHS. Day after the referendum, he said that figure was a mistake, which calls into question what other mistakes he may have made. So he faces a bit of a credibility issue. and he generally, as Jason was saying, he's not very well liked. So I think there's a lot of challenges that they will face.
Well,
In
the question is here, and let me go to Jason. Um, okay, we know the UK Independence Party was in favor, and so of Brexit, and so you're going to have politicians in that party that that were supporting Brexit. But going to the two main parties, Labour and Tories, Conservatives, whatever, who supported Brexit in those major parties? Were there any politicians from either of those two parties that were?
Yeah, and they joined in with the Leave campaign. They stood alongside Nigel Farage. I mean, Boris Johnson is one of them. Michael Gove is another one. He's a former government minister for education. There's a couple of others. You know, they had a kind of a coalition. But I mean, the thing is, everything is changing so fast at the moment. You know, from one day to the next, it's like, you know, even like this afternoon, I heard calls for a general election, and that would change things completely. I've heard calls for a new party to be formed, or two new parties, because the old ones, the Tories, Labour, they're just both completely shot. Nobody trusts them. You know, there's a referendum, sorry, a petition for a referendum going around at the moment from all the sore losers, the people that voted for Remain. They are so angry that you know they decided they need another referendum, and this time they will actually go out and vote. Because in the last one, it was raining heavily in London, and a lot of them couldn't be bothered to go out and vote. So, well, I don't think that has much of a chance of getting off the ground, to be honest.
So you know, there is this talk of more, you know, referendums and splits and so forth. We have this big difference in the voting patterns between Scotland and Ireland on the one hand, who voted heavily, it's Northern Ireland actually, heavily to remain, whereas Britain and Wales voted to Brexit, and they won. So now the people in Scotland and in Ireland, Northern Ireland, want to leave the UK so that they can then stay in the EU. How do you think those things are going to play out? The secessionary voting and so forth.
Yeah,
Jason, you want to start with that?
It's complex. It's very complex because I think Scotland, the majority voted to remain in Scotland because they don't like being ruled from London. They want to have the, you know, the kind of the tempering influence of Brussels. But now that, you know, if England leaves, if you like, that's going to change everything again, because Scotland then faces the prospect of being a tiny country within the EU. They're not going to get a very good deal out of it. So if they have another referendum, people might recognise that, and then they might vote to stay. And as for Northern Ireland, I don't know exactly why, because normally in Northern Ireland people are very loyal to Britain. But I suspect it might have something to do with the peace process, which they've had going on there for a long time. That is, I believe, enshrined in some kind of European document, which could potentially be invalidated if we were to leave, which would mean, you know, all these people would have claims again on Ireland and Northern Ireland, and you know, they basically want to avoid the troubles restarting.
Yeah, and that certainly was a very rough period for many years for Ireland, and the troubles. So, Monsta, do you see? Can you identify any, you know, main reasons for Scotland and Ireland being so different than Britain and Wales in this whole thing? And what do you see about the future, you know, for them as they move down the line?
it is difficult to answer your first question about why there's such a big difference. I, s- I guess it could be like a dislike of the London vote. They want to sort of counterbalance, as it were, to the effect of Westminster. So they have Brussels controlling London to some extent. Maybe the other one I can think of is they have more faith in the Scottish Nationalist Party than England do with Labour, so they're more inclined to listen to their campaigns of staying in the EU. That might be another thing that might have made a difference, but I can't really say with any degree of certainty if that made an effect. But those are just possibilities as to why there is a difference. Um,
There is,
but the fact, yeah.
sorry, I was
Mm,
going to say that one factor that some people overlook is that right across the British Isles, people in cities generally, in the wealthier areas, they voted to stay.
mm,
And Scotland, mostly, it's population-wise, it's Glasgow and Edinburgh. And Edinburgh, in particular, is quite a wealthy place. A lot of young people. These people fit the profile of any Brit to stay. So I think that had quite an effect on it. Because if you look at the Highlands and the islands, they were not so keen on staying
but the
in the.
But the thing I would say against that is every region in Scotland voted to stay. All 32 regions in Scotland voted to stay in the EU. So I can see what you're coming from. The cities would vote to stay in, but the fact of the matter is every place in Scotland voted in, and even in England, if you look at places like Manchester and Birmingham, they really were not supportive of it. And I think this is one of the problems that Labour have on their hands, like the big industrial places that were strongholds like Newcastle and Sunderland. Newcastle, what was it? I think Newcastle just about did it, but Sunderland, was it Sunderland who voted to leave?
Yeah, I mean
But
that's
Newcastle just about did it. So I think this whole city business, it just didn't fly. The only place really was London that supported it, and there was a few places in the south, some regions, but not all. There was,
mm,
and I think so. It's really difficult to say why exactly, for me anyway.
mm,
But as to their future, it's if they have a referendum, I would be inclined to think they would stay in England. I mean, they don't like Westminster, but I don't think they're completely in bed with the people in Brussels. And the problem as well for Scotland, if they want to join the EU, is they'll be a small nation in it, and they won't be very strong. And the other thing is they will one of the conditions for gaining independence is they need to form their own currency. So they would no longer have the pound to use. They will have to adopt the euro, I guess. That would be the logical um, answer. And I'm not sure if Scotland would want to join and take the euro. That might be a bridge too far. And also there might be the economics of it all. They might just think, they get they're a net beneficiary to England in terms of how funds are distributed, and they will have in terms of foreign influence, they might be able to use the English clout to get what they want. So I think economics and politics will ultimately be the factors that make them stay. But I think it will be a close run thing, and I got the whole outcome of the BREXIT wrong. So you don't know; they might get independence, but I think it's going to be tough because joining the EU as a separate entity is a big enough move, but to go from the pound to the euro is another thing, and I don't know if the Scots are enamored by the euro, especially the way it's going these days.
mm.
Well, the big question there, as far as when you say joining the EU, and not being enamored of the people running that organization. The whole issue with them is that there doesn't seem to be any democratic method. I mean, it's not like Scots can vote for who the bureaucrats are that are running, Brussels. There's no direct voting or anything of EU members or of people in these states for the bureaucrats who are running the system. So the whole thing seems to completely democratic to me. I don't really understand how Brussels has managed to gain so much power without there being any democratic type of systems where the people have some say in how they operate. Everybody pays taxes to Brussels, but nobody can, nobody can vote anybody out of office there. It's kind of nuts. But anyway, let's go from the political side of this clusterfuck to the economic aspects of it, which we started alluding to, which is the pound and the euro and how this is affecting the currencies. So far, I think the pound has dropped something like 10% in one day, and then there are people lining up to try to change pounds for euros or dollars or whatever. What are you seeing with that, Jason, with the financial end?
Well, I mean, the markets thought that Brexit wouldn't happen, and it did, because all the polls were wrong. I don't know how they managed to get the polls so wrong, 2 times in a row, but they did. So it was a financial shock, and I think we're going to see a lot more shocks in the coming week, probably tomorrow. So again, I mean, anything could happen at this stage. I mean, nobody knows. You just can't make any predictions at this stage. A lot of shares dropped by like 50% on Friday in Britain. And then, yeah, of course, the currency dropped by 10%, which is going to put a lot of pressure on a few American banks that have offices in London, because now all of a sudden they're worth 10% less. There's going to be a lot of margin calls going on. Economic chaos in the short term because of the finances. In the slightly longer term, Britain does a lot of trade with the rest of the EU. We buy a lot of cars off Germany, bought on credit, a lot of BMWs and Mercedes and stuff. Germany can't just turn around and say we're not allowed those cars anymore. I mean, how's that going to affect their industry? So it's as you said, it's a complete clusterfuck. Nobody really knows what's going on. On the one hand, you've got now Brussels saying they want Britain out of the EU, like immediately, get out of here.
Right. That timing aspect of it is another interesting question.
And then at the same time, you've got Angela Merkel saying, "Well, no, we should be nice to them." So who knows? I mean, we could potentially go and strike trade deals around the world, with China and Russia, and maybe that's what this is all about. Maybe it's part of the long-term game plan to sort of get the hell out of the EU. It might have been spun to the electorate in a certain way, but maybe the long-term plan is to get away from a continent that is sinking. It's sinking in economic malaise. I think that some people must be thinking that anyway.
Yeah. Matzo, where do you see these economic effects, near-term ones versus long-term ones, as far as Britain is concerned?
I think to be precise in a prediction is difficult because, as several people have been saying already, the state of affairs is in flux at the moment. Nobody knows anything. So it's hard to say. I generally think in the short term there will be some chaos, and a lot of it will stem from uncertainty. So I think the pound will get weaker, the financial markets will take a hit, and this could expose potential weaknesses in the banking system in general. It can affect people who have got mortgages and savings, because those could go up because of uncertainty in the markets, and they might reduce interest rates from near zero to zero and maybe even minus, so that could hit savers. There's a bunch of things that can happen which we're not really sure, but I think in the medium to longer term, I would generally agree with what the people in the Leave campaign said. I think the consequences the negative consequences, I should say, have been overblown. I don't think the sky's going to fall on England if they leave the EU. That's assuming they don't sort of make a cock up of negotiations. They are semi-competent in getting something through the Brussels. I think they'll be okay. I'm not going to say it's going to be heaps and heaps of economic growth, but it's all relative. I think they'll be okay if you compare it to France and other EU states. So, and I think in terms of leaving, it may benefit them because they can focus from an economical point of view. They can focus on other deals with China, America, and what have you, and they won't be constrained by the EU. And at the same time, if they're away from the EU and the whole thing blows up, it's kind of a good thing to sort of keep your hat away from the volcano when it erupts. So, leaving the membership party and having a more distant relationship can help them in the event, or in the likely event of the EU just disintegrating. I think one thing, and this is a big factor that can affect the outcome for Britain, is whether they strike a deal where they get access to the shared market. A lot of people are saying that they want England to have a similar relationship to Norway. Norway are not part of the EU, but they do have access to the shared market. And they say, if England could secure that, they will the negative repercussions in the medium to longer term will be less. That's what they say. England, they do 44% of their exports. They go into Europe, so to have access to that market would help them by a measurable extent. But the problem with that one is you have to take on the whole free movement of people, which is going against what Farage and Boris Johnson said. So if they want to do that, they kind of have to do a bit of a U-turn, and I don't know how people are going to like that. And the other thing as well, which comes with the shared market, is they have to pay into the EU, which is what they did as a member, which is another thing that they one of their promises were, that they would have to pay the EU. They could pay for the NHS or what have you. So that's another thing. And they will be bound by EU laws that come into effect in the future. And by not being a member, they just have to take the laws. They can't have a say in how they're created. So you can argue they didn't have much of a say when they were in the EU, but they will have no say when they're out of it. So it is an interesting choice. I don't think they can weasel out of these terms. I think they'll have to take the terms if they want the shared agreement, or they will just have to control immigration, but then they have to make individual agreements with each EU country, which could take a while. And you just get the feeling the EU would block such things, because at the end of the day, they're going to play hardball because their existence is on the line. If England doesn't implode and does relatively well, I think the EU is finished. And I think the people in the EU, they know this, and that's why they're saying get the deal started today, because they know the less time England have, the weaker their position in negotiations.
Well, this aspect of contagion is definitely an important one, and the fact that it's not just the English or the British or Welsh or whatever that have been unhappy with Brussels. You've got Beppe Grillo's party down in Italy, the Five-Star Party. They've been wanting to leave the EU. You've got Pablo Iglesias' party, Podemos in Spain, wanting to leave. Marine Le Pen's party in France, they want to leave the EU, and then Geert Wilders' party in the Netherlands wants to leave the EU. So, are these other countries going to be holding referendums anytime soon? And how do you think those things are going to play out, Chase?
Well, that is the EU's big worry at the moment. I mean, Britain has held a referendum, and we were not supposed to hold a referendum, but we did, and we were supposed to vote to stay, and we didn't. Now the EU, in my opinion, because there are 8 other countries that are lining up to hold a referendum now, because they want out. I mean, Euroscepticism is widespread now. It's going all the way across the continent. I mean, even in France, it's something like 60% or 6% or something. And over here, this was not talked about at all during the referendum campaign. Kind of Europeans were considered to be a kind of a homogenous blob of, kind of liberals who all love being in the EU. But that's not the case at all. I mean, I've lived in 4 different EU countries. I know to some extent what people are like there. I mean, I used to live in Denmark, and they had at least 2 referendums already on the EU over the years. And their choices were overruled. But now they're looking at them, they're saying, well, yeah, we want that as well now. So they're restive. So Brussels is obviously not going to allow that to happen. One thing I think they might do is punish the UK, or whatever we're going to be called, because we can't be called the UK if we're not a United Kingdom. Somebody suggested Poundland, but yeah. So Brussels will probably do their best to make to punish us, to make an example of us. Look what happened to them. They are eating grass now. They left. So that's something that we've got to look out for, I think.
Well, this whole question of timeline on how it is going to play out. First of all, Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty has to be invoked, which it has not been yet, even before the divorce proceedings can begin. So the EU is pushing for somebody in power in Britain to make a formal statement or write a formal letter that says, we want out, so that they can get this process started. But then even after it starts, it's a 2-year-long process of
minimum
of negotiations, right? Well, I think I read somewhere that at the end of 2 years, if it's not all worked out, then the ties are just cut, and everything's left hanging. I guess I don't know what they mean by that, but there's so many of these regulations that regarding trade and how many fish you can take out of the water. I know I saw a video on that, how the fishing industry in Britain has been decimated by the membership in the EU and so forth. So all of those different things have to be negotiated, I think, individually. And it's hard to, it's just hard to imagine how they're going to do it inside of 2 years. But even 2 years is a really long time. And how can this kind of chaos go on for 2 straight years? I mean, it'd be insane.
It can't.
It can't, right?
No, it's going to collapse pretty quickly. I mean, like, I'll give you an example. You mentioned fishing then. I live in Britain's biggest fishing port. You wouldn't know that because there's only a few fishing boats here. But I was actually out last Wednesday on the sea in a little kayak with a couple of other people, and we heard this big racket and we looked up, and there was about 50 fishing boats like flying towards us really fast, making a lot of noise and flying flags saying leave. And then on the shore, people gathered and they were like cheering. So we basically had like hundreds of families cheering these fishermen because their livelihoods have been in the EU. So they fished these waters for 1,000 years, and now something like 95% of them are out of business. But 3 miles offshore, you have like huge factory fleets owned by Spanish and French fishing concerns, just kind of hauling out the fish out of the sea. And these Cornish fishermen, they're not allowed to do anything. They're allowed to catch like 200 kilos of fish a day, and these bigger boats are allowed to catch 20,000 a day. So they were very, very in favour of us leaving the EU, for self-preservation. So now, we've had the referendum. A majority of people have voted to leave it. What are these fishermen going to do? Because they actually still catch the fish in 5 tons at a time or whatever, but they have to throw back dead 95% of their catch, and they've been doing that for years. And they're not even allowed to land it and give it away to like homeless shelters or anything. So what are these fishermen going to do now that they've got the kind of the green light? They're not going to wait 2 years or 5 years or whatever. They're just going to start breaking the law immediately, in my opinion.
One would think, right? One would think.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any other way, any other type of behavior that would occur. And the fishing business is one of the most interesting. And then there's the energy business too, and that plays with Scotland and just possibly seceding. Who gets what's left of the oil money coming out of the North Sea and so forth. Yeah, either of you guys got some thoughts on how this might affect the oil business over there?
Well, leaving the EU.
Either leaving the EU or possible breakup of the UK.
Well, if the Scotland leaves the UK, I guess they would take the revenue because most of the oil is up north in Scotland. But I don't think the events of the BREXIT will have a huge impact. I think this is more to do with global oil prices. They will have more of an effect, and even then, I think the effect will be limited due to the fact that oil production in Scotland is just not the same as it was 10 years ago, and it's just, I mean, it has stabilized a little bit in the last few years, to be fair, but it is quite on a small base. It's like sort of basing your future on the future production of Alaska. The oil prices might bring up production a little bit, but it's not going to have a big effect, and in the future it's just going to be non-existent. So I think it's like a bit of a non-issue. Well, probably the Scots won't be happy with it, but I don't think it's going to be a big issue. I don't know about the fracking business in Scotland. I don't know if that will kick off, but in terms of the North Sea oil, I just don't see much of that. Much will come of it. What do you think, Jason?
Well, I mean, I agree, but I think the North Sea oil, it's kind of almost dead from what I've been reading. It costs them, I don't know how much, maybe $100 a barrel to get out, and they can sell it for what, 50 the most. So it's a dying business. I mean, it's also got like double-digit decline rates every year. There can't be more than a handful of years left anyway. And this is the crucial thing, because the Scottish politicians during their referendum, they were saying, there's many years, sell it at like $100 or $150 a barrel. So the economic basis of that is gone. So, that would be a big problem for Scotland. And they're now talking about, we've got a lot of wind, so they're going to build wind farms everywhere. But we know from kind of world that we inhabit online. But it's very hard to get a big grid operating on wind power alone. So I think there's a lot of challenges that haven't really been talked about much.
Yeah, the intermittency problem with wind power and balancing against the load on the grid and all of that stuff. In theory, these ideas are great, but in practical reality, making such a system work is quite difficult. I mean, if you have other plants, that can pick up the load in periodic times, it can, cut your total energy usage or fuel usage. But just by itself, it's very hard to see how something like that works. Just one other. Let's just talk a little bit about one other subject that we had initially started with when we originally scheduled this broadcast, which was before the Brexit, is TTIP and these various trade partnerships that are being promoted around the world, and the TTIP is just one example of these things. And negotiations are held in secret for the most part. Nobody really knows exactly what's in some of these documents, although there's a lot of supposition that it's very much corporate, in favor of the corporations as opposed to the nations. You guys got any thoughts on these trade partnership deals that are going on out there? Want to take off?
Well, the thing is, it does sound like a corporate wet dream. These potential negotiations, if they go through, the saying goes that the EU had provisionally agreed to the US to these terms and conditions, but I'm not 100% sure on that, because apparently I've been hearing stories that the French have tried to veto the whole thing because they don't see much of a benefit for Europe. They just see this as a benefit for US corporations, so they're against it, and they're trying to fight it, whereas places like in Germany, they're more supportive of the TTIP. I think one of the advantages of leaving the EU, at least provisionally, was the fact that if England leaves, they're automatically cut out from this deal. So they would have to arrange something separate with the US if they wanted to get in on the TTIP. I suppose just to give a background on the TTIP, the whole deal was that, or the way that what we do know of the TTIP is it's sold as a way of reducing trade barriers. It sounds good on paper when you just put it that way, but there's not really big tariffs between Europe and England. So when they mean trade barriers, what they really mean is reducing regulations. So like the food industry in Europe has generally got more regulations than the Americans. So we don't like GM foods as much. We don't like putting growth hormones and all the all that kind of stuff that goes on in America that is a bit more regulated. That will go, and they will reduce regulations in other industries. And what was I going to say? Just trying to think. I've lost my trail of thought.
Well, the onerous, thing I think that I see in it is the adjudication system and the ability of corporations to go ahead and sue countries that don't allow them to sell their shit, or whatever. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's the thing. I sort of I lost my trail of thought.
I had a feeling that was where you were going, and so that's why I jumped in.
So basically, with that one is the U.S. corporations will have access to public markets. So anything run by the government, they would be forced, or they would have more leverage to privatize and open these markets. So that for England would potentially mean things like the NHS could be opened up to big pharmaceutical companies to just basically gobble it up. That is a big concern, and if the government in question tried to defend these markets, they could be sued by corporations. So that's a big one. Again, it's all speculation because everything is in secret. There is some leaks out there, but in more recent times, it's all done under the hush, so we don't know. That's just what we do know comes from leaks, and things, I guess, evolve over time. New aspects being made, so it's difficult to say if you can get more specific than that. But that's the nature of the deal. It reduces regulation, red tape. It gives power to corporations, and it's done all in secret. You have to go into a room under escort. You're not allowed to take electronic equipment. I think that says it all, really, about what you can expect from this kind of deal.
Yeah, Jason, you got some thoughts on that, on TTIP and how it?
Well, yeah, because from what I've been reading, following Brexit, TTIP is effectively dead in the water, because the UK, we act as a kind of a Trojan horse for you guys to get into the EU, and without the UK, there can be no deal. They just can't. I mean, we are, I say we. My government is
or the government I am trapped under living.
Yeah, they are they are one of the big drivers in this whole process, and with so much uncertainty, and so much of this referendum has thrown so much light onto things like TTIP. It's got people talking about them. I mean, a lot of people didn't even know really what the EU was beforehand, and now everyone's talking about it. Half the people are saying it's undemocratic and ruled by clowns and everything. So a lot of people have kind of been educated in this, and that can only be a good thing, because before most people just assumed it was this benign kind of uncle, like Uncle Stalin, Maybe not Uncle Stalin, but yeah, he's starting to look like Uncle Joe Stalin now. But it's thrown so much light onto these secretesses that even, I can see online that even the most staunch defenders of the EU are now kind of toning down. They're going, okay, well, I accept that it's undemocratic and Mario Draghi is crazy and etc. 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 But I still want to be part of the EU. The whole argument has been taken out from underneath them. And I'd say a word about that, actually. The whole tone of debate is completely off the scale. I mean, I've never experienced anything like that in my life. I mean, I have been personally trolled pretty badly because I voted for Leave. And I'm pretty much the only person I know who voted for Leave. So I've been kind of excommunicated from a section of society now.
What about you, Monster? Have you admitted to which way you voted in this one? I won't put the finger on you. You don't have to tell us. You don't have to tell us. I wouldn't want you to be ostracized by your family and friends and all the rest of that.
Well, I think Jason is not gonna like my answer. I voted to stay. Surprisingly enough, I just thought, I mean, I was kind of on the fence because when I actually was thinking stay, leave, and I practically decided in the actual ballot box itself to stay. But my feeling was, I thought maybe if I felt England was going to stay in the EU, and if they do, the EU has enough legs that it would probably last like a decade or longer before it finally bellies up. I think definitely the removal of England accelerates the timeline, but I just thought my reasoning is it's not going to end that soon, and if you bail out too early, it does put you in a weaker position. you have to look at it in the sense of, how people, they just lived on the land in the 70s and they're waiting 30 or 40 years for the collapse, and you lose out by doing that. I kind of saw it in that kind of light. I know it's flawed, but I just think there's a timing for these things. So that's kind of my reasoning behind it. In regards to Jason, I think I knew quite a few people who voted to leave. Even people at my work were saying I should vote to leave. So there's no orchestration on that level. But I think one of the things I would say is there are people who vote to leave, but they don't really give good reasons for leaving. And I think Jason puts a good argument, and people at my work, they put a good argument. But I think there's some people who just say stuff like, oh yeah, I think there was on the news, there was this lady saying, oh, the steel industry's gone from England, it's because of the EU. If we left the EU, it will come back. And it's like, no, the job is gone. Those jobs are gone and they're not coming back. It's misguided. And, some people, they do say the immigration issue is the thing, and they believe that immigration will go down if you leave the EU. I don't really believe that. I think it will probably stay more or less the same, because even if they do put blocks on the migrants coming in from the EU, they'll just get migrants from Africa or China or wherever. They'll find someone to pick those fruits from the farms. So by hook or by crook, it will happen. And I just think that that's not going to change. So I think there are a lot of people who are misguided, and I just think, generally speaking, in this world, there are more misinformed people than informed people. That's just the way the world works. I'm just putting it diplomatic there, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for every Jason, you'll get 10 or 50 idiots who will support Trump and go for the same reasons of leaving the EU. The Trump reasons. Let's put it that way. So I'm not saying there are no legitimate arguments, and I think it can work out better for England if they play their cards right. But I don't think people, it's all about what why you believe rather than what you believe. That's what I think.
Well, I think that the vast majority of the population is stupid. To put it undemocratically.
I was putting it diplomatically by saying
they don't pay attention to the topics. They don't analyze the reasons why these things are happening. They just kind of go through their lives in a haze. They're in the matrix, right? And whatever comes across the MSM must be the truth, and they follow along in herds behind people like Trump, and think that that's going to change and resolve their problems, but the problems are just going to start to spiral upward here. All right, well, we had a pretty good discussion. We went around an hour here. Let me just give you guys one more chance before we go to give me some closing thoughts on where you think we're going to go next week, what's going to happen in the markets. Make a prediction here. How low can it go? Jason, what do you think?
Well, I mean, this could be the big one, I mean, it could be Bear Stearns moment tomorrow, where the bodies are going to come up, I reckon, this week. Some serious stuff is going to go down in the world of finance this coming week. I don't know how it will turn out. I mean, that you've got the central bankers saying yet again they're going to do whatever it takes to bail out the banks or the markets or whatever.
How are they going to bail out Deutsche Bank?
What it takes.
How are they going to bail out Deutsche Bank?
Yeah, I mean, what are they going to use? They've run out of money and credibility. So I think we're going to see a different stage of the game starting now, and I don't know how it's going to cascade down and affect mortal people. I mean, I went to the supermarket yesterday and I bought a lot of pasta, tins of beans, that sort of thing, because I don't know if I'll be able to do that soon.
Yeah, yeah. That's well. I have my stockpile of
Yeah.
a couple of years worth of dried foods here. Whatnot. Uh, but yeah, it's you do wonder, and I do see that comparison is this the Bear Stearns or is it the Lehman moment? And
Mm.
Bear Stearns was kind of like the lead up to Lehman, and so this from some of the pundits, this may not be the big one, just the lead up to the big one. So that's I think the cascade is going to be very interesting to watch in the coming week. Matza, any last thoughts? Final thoughts?
I think if you're gonna have to say a moment, I'm not sure if it'll be as big, but it'll be more of a Burn Stearns moment. The Lehman Brother moment is gonna be the time when other nations they all decide to join the line to leave the EU. That's a Lehman moment in steroids. So I think it could be a Burn Stearns moment, but we'll see. I
Well, I
think
think
the other thing you have to remember is these people have been bailing out the banks for 8 years. We always said, oh, the banks they can't do this for more than 1 year. They can't do this for more than 2 years. It's been 8 years now, so they're pretty good at finding ways of keeping this system up. So I wouldn't discount them finding some tricks. There's bailouts, there's bail-ins, there's zero interest, there's free helicopter money, there's changing, of accounting rules. There's a whole shebang. So they'll find something, or they'll do anything to keep this thing under control. So.
Yeah, well, that's true. Jason, you had something that you wanted to interject
Yeah, I
there?
mean, Monty was just saying, oh, well, it's going to go potentially badly wrong when the next EU country does something. I think, well, we've just been on air talking. I think Podemos just won big in Spain, so they're going to form a coalition with the socialists, which means that the ruling party at the moment, the PP, they don't have any power anymore. So that's another kick to the EU.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
one thing I would say to that, one thing I would say is if another nation really pushes for referendum and God forbid to the EU they actually vote to leave, it would put England's position stronger when it comes to negotiating, because if they play hardball, then they will have another country who will side with them, because they will think, actually, we want a good deal, so we need to stroke someone's back.
Yeah.
So to say. So the more people who think of leaving, the more support England will get, and actually that will make the outcome for the EU worse in the longer run.
Yeah, well, and the possible idea that these various exit campaigns from these different countries, if they would start to work together with each other, as opposed to each individually trying to pull out, perhaps there could be more power in working together as a group. There are all sorts of possibilities, but at any rate, and we're not going to be able to work them out in this episode of the Collapse Cafe for sure. But it was an opportunity to take an early look with my British friends about Brexit, about one of the biggest events that has occurred here in the world of collapse over the last month or couple of months. But there's always something new, isn't there? We never have a shortage these days of material that is examples of our society, a civilization that is coming apart at the seams. Okay, well, just once more, let me remind you to drop a donation on Sun and help us build a better tomorrow. And that's all to do this time until next time here on the Collapse Cafe. Later, diners.